to the conversation. My name is Renato. I'm the research manager of the Open Data Charter. The Open Data Charter is a global civil society organization that was born 10 years ago. We were born actually as a charter with 6 principles that different governments and civil society organizations adopted on how to collect, publish, and reuse data. So I'm not going to spend time, but these are the principles. You can check it in our website if you're not familiarized. And we have been working in open data, and we have been reshaping a little bit our mission and vision, um, trying to understand data governance and the intersection it has with the new technologies. So we have started working also in dialogue with digital public infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and also trying to balance the right of access to information and personal data protection. So that's how we started 4 years ago to work in the agenda of artificial intelligence. And our projects are always with a focus on data, how data is regulated, the data frameworks and the intersection with the AI strategies or policies or regulations, and also the data quality that fits artificial intelligence systems nowadays. So we are trying to develop research for mainly for our network of governments and adopters, but also for different forums and different organizations and governments that want to understand how data is dialoguing with these new technologies. So particularly now about this session, it's connected especially to, we have many ongoing research at this moment, but one of them is connected to this session specifically, that is supported by Microsoft, and it explores the legal and ethical boundaries of using publicly accessible data for AI training, with a focus on the boundaries that we can find in, especially in data protection and copyright. And it's something new for us because we always work mainly in open government data, and now we are exploring a first project in public accessible data. That is a concept that is a little bit wider. So we want to really try to understand what happens with that data that is available, what are the boundaries to use or reuse it in a responsible way. So we are going to share different reflections. The project has just started, so we are going to share some initial findings, but it's going to go on during several months. And we are also going to hear perspectives from colleagues from other organizations, from Asia and from Latin America. So I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. My speakers here are Fola Adelek. He's the Executive Director of the Global Center on AI Governance. The Global Center on AI Governance is working together with us in this project, so it's a really fruitful collaboration. We also have Vinay Narayan, is Policy Senior Manager at APTI, and Violeta Belver, that is a Communications Manager at ILDA. We are going to, I don't know if you all have Wi-Fi or you all have access to internet, but we're going to try to do a few interactive questions through Menti. So I hope it works. If it doesn't work well, we can talk in the end of the session. But I think Menti is a nice tool to generate engagement. So before we move into our first presentations, there's a first question. If you want to scan the QR and tell us what sector do you work in, private sector, civil society organizations, academia, government, just to figure out a little bit how our audience is. So you can scan the QR and just send your answers if it works well. And if not, we can talk in the Q&A session. And then I'm going to share with you our first question, our first deeper question. And then I move to my speakers. But please feel free to scan the QR and then I can show it again in the end. So if you use publicly accessible data, now we are going to explain a little bit of the context and the frameworks, but if you use, what kind of data are you using for analytics or AI training, and for what kind of analysis? In your work, in your research, in your studies, in your university? We are really interested in knowing a little bit of your perceptions and your experience. So you can scan the QR and then we have more questions, but we are going to come back for them after we have our presentations. So first of all, I'm going to give the floor to Fola. Let me introduce him. Fola Delek is the executive director and co-founder of the Global Center on AI Governance. He leads the Knowledge Hub, the African Observatory on Responsible AI. He holds a PhD in International Investment Law and Human Rights from the University of Witwatersrand and completed his postdoctoral research as a Fulbright Scholar at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investments in the Columbia University and the Human Rights Program in Harvard University. So Fola, thank you so much for being here and for joining us. And if we can switch the presentation.
Thank you very much, Renato, and good afternoon, everyone. We are quite grateful that you are joining the very last session of the day. We know it's been a very long day, and the room is also a bit quite cold. So thank you so much for braving the weather to be in this session. So, like Renato mentioned, so I co-lead the Global Center on AI Governance, and we are partnering with ODC to work on a project on publicly accessible data and its use in AI training. And the focus of the research really is to essentially look at the regulatory safeguards that are available for responsible use of publicly accessible data. And we are in terms of the context for this work really, we recognize that AI training, is increasingly relying on data that is available on the web. So it's focusing on open data sets. But in the utilization of this data, the rules are really unclear about whether folks have the right to analyze data that they're accessing publicly, even when copyright regimes we know have specific regulations in place to manage the right to access some data. And the question then really becomes, well, when the copyright regime doesn't really speak directly to data that's already available, does it then mean that it is free to use? What also happens with data protection laws, which nevertheless still apply to personal data even if they are publicly available? The fact that you know you can publicly access people's personal data on social media platforms does not necessarily mean that you can use that data for training AI models. And so you've got these governance gaps, which essentially creates uncertainty for innovators, for public sector users and communities. Increasingly, you would have seen that there's a conversation around governments serving as a provider of data for AI. And that's largely because, especially in global south context, governments essentially have the most diverse data sets available to them. And some of these data sets are publicly available as well. And the governance regime that govern the responsible use of that data needs to be assessed. How do we enable legitimate AI development when protecting rights, privacy, and trust? So the main research question really in this project is to understand the extent to which publicly accessible data can be reused in AI training while respecting data protection, copyright, and imaginary regulations. So we are focusing on three core frameworks, as you can see: data protection, copyright, and imaginary AI regulations. And within that main research question, we're trying to understand how organizations, both private sector organizations, non-state actors, as well as state actors, interpret exceptions within these three frameworks, especially in terms of text and data mining. We are also trying to understand perceptions. So this is not just a desktop-based research. We want to understand whether stakeholders themselves believe copyright restrict analytical use of public data, and what then safeguards and mechanisms can be used for responsible reuse. So the focus of the research is initially on these three countries, and Orianto will speak more to why specifically these three countries, but you can see that it's essentially spans the globe. So you're looking at Brazil and Latin America, you know, Japan in Asia, and Australia as well. And across these three countries, our focus is on law guidance, practice perceptions, and safeguards. This research is still ongoing. So we've done some initial desktop research, and the perceptions, interviews and surveys is going to come later on. So it's a mixed method approach that we're taking to the research. Right. We've done the initial desk research looking at laws, case laws, policy, and industry practice. Well, I should say it's ongoing, and then and like I said, the surveys and interviews are going to come later on. And so, just as a brief introduction, in the Brazilian context, you've got a copyright law, but there's no explicit text and data mining exception within that, right? So nothing really that governs this question around responsible reuse of publicly available data. You've got a very strong data protection law, which requires, purpose, good faith, and public interest in the use of personal data. You've got an AI governance law that is emerging, which speaks about, AI use and oversight. Because it's still emerging, there's a potential opportunity there for the law to potentially clarify text and data mining. And then there's an open data policy within the Brazilian context, which has an open by default approach, especially in relation to, government generated data. Japan has a slightly different approach, right? Japan has a very, at least from our own interpretation of the Copyright Act in Japan, it certainly creates, an avenue for potential, reuse of publicly available data. It has a very broad permission for information analysis, provided that the user is not using it for their own enjoyment. And then they also have a data protection law, which
Yeah, yes, I mean the point I was when we are using public available data, where we are reusing that data, and what we're trying to say is they're not free of limitations. Even if the data is anonymized, it doesn't mean that, for example, it won't contain any sort of bias, any sort of different aspects of what they chose to include in that data and what they chose not to include in that data. So it has, as we say, consequences, especially when you are using that data in the cross and intersection with more data for analysis. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if we have more time for one more question or we have to close. No, I think that we don't have more time. Well, I want to thank really everyone for being here in this long day. And I hope that some of the ideas really reflect on you. For us in this research, it's just the first step. So we will be happy to keep on touch. And yes, here's my email if you want to keep in contact. We are just starting. We are going to be sharing the results as we advance, and we hope we can keep the conversation. We ran out of time and we couldn't do all the questions that we wanted, but this is just the beginning. So I'd be happy to catch up and chat with you later. Thank you so much.